The morning sun bathed downtown Atlanta in a soft golden hue, bouncing off glass buildings and casting long shadows over the old courthouse steps. On that quiet street corner, a man stood, tall, elegant despite his age, his posture firm yet calm. His silver hair glowed beneath his fedora, and his polished cane tapped lightly on the pavement as he looked across the street at the courthouse he once presided over. Harold Benton, retired Chief Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court, had come to see the new plaque being unveiled in his honor that morning. But he had arrived early, wanting a quiet moment to take it all in before the crowds gathered. Unfortunately, that calm was about to be shattered. A black and white cruiser pulled up beside him. Two young officers, Patrolman Scott and Officer Miller, stepped out. Both were new recruits, eager to make a name for themselves. They noticed Harold standing by the courthouse steps in his three-piece suit, holding a folder and a cane. To them, he looked like an old man with nowhere to go. Scott squinted. "Hey, Miller, we've had reports of loitering around here lately. You see that guy?" "Yeah," Miller replied. "Kinda odd just standing there staring at the building, maybe casing the place." Harold turned slightly as they approached, his kind eyes soft but observant. "Good morning, officers," he greeted, his voice smooth as aged oak. Scott ignored the greeting. "Sir, what are you doing here?" "I'm waiting for the courthouse event," Harold replied, smiling. "They're unveiling something today." Scott frowned. "You have ID on you?" "Of course," Harold said, reaching slowly for his wallet. "But may I ask what this is about?" Miller crossed his arms. "We've had suspicious activity in the area, sir. You match the description." Harold raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious activity?" "I'm standing on a public sidewalk, officer." That tone, calm, measured, confident, irked Scott. "Don't get smart with me. Let's see some ID." Harold handed over his driver's license. The name read Harold Benton. Scott frowned. "Benton? That's supposed to mean something?" Harold chuckled lightly. Perhaps it should, but the officers didn't bother checking properly. Instead, they exchanged a glance. Miller muttered, "Old guy's probably making stuff up." Scott took out his cuffs. "All right, sir, you're coming with us." "Excuse me?" Loitering, refusing to comply. "You're obstructing official duty." The cold click of handcuffs echoed off the marble steps. People nearby stopped and stared. Harold didn't resist. He simply shook his head, a weary sadness in his eyes. As they led him toward the cruiser, a young woman hurried over. Lena, a courthouse intern. "Wait, what are you doing? That's—" Scott snapped. "Ma'am, step back." She froze, fumbling for words. "You don't understand, that's—" But before she could finish, the car door slammed. Harold sat inside, his reflection staring back at him through the glass. Inside the station, as they began to process him, Miller leaned on the desk. "Name again?" "Harold Benton," Harold said softly. "Former Chief Justice of this state." Scott smirked. "Yeah, sure. And I'm the president." The clerk at the desk, an older sergeant, looked up from his computer. His brow furrowed. "Wait, what did you say your name was?" "Harold Benton." The sergeant typed quickly, then froze. His face went pale as he turned toward the two young officers. You arrested Justice Harold Benton?" Scott blinked. "Who? The man who built half the justice system in this state, that's who. The first black Chief Justice in Georgia history." Miller stammered. You're kidding." The sergeant shook his head, horror filling his eyes. "You two just cuffed a living legend for loitering." In that instant, the weight of their mistake crashed down on them. The young officers turned toward Harold, who sat calmly in the chair, his expression unreadable. He met their eyes and spoke softly. "Perhaps now, officers, you understand why justice should never be based on appearances." The silence that followed was heavy, almost sacred. And as the realization settled in, the young men realized they hadn't just arrested a man, they had handcuffed history itself. The precinct buzzed with a nervous energy that morning, every whispered conversation pointing toward the same room, the small grey interview chamber where Justice Harold Benton sat, his hands still cuffed in front of him. Though his posture remained regal, his silence carried a weight that made even the most seasoned officers uneasy. Outside, Sergeant Lopez was barking orders. "Get the chief on the phone, now!" His face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. He'd been in the department for over 25 years and had seen his share of blunders. But this? Arresting the former Chief Justice on a charge of loitering? It was beyond humiliating. Inside the observation room, officers Scott and Miller stood stiffly, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Scott muttered, "We didn't know who he was. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there. That's exactly the problem," Lopez snapped. "You didn't know, and you didn't ask." The chief, Miranda Evans, stormed in moments later. Her sharp heels clicked across the tile as she entered, her eyes locked on the two young men. "Uncuff him," she ordered coldly. Scott hesitated, but Lopez barked again. "You heard her." They hurried inside, fumbling with the keys. The metallic sound of the cuffs releasing echoed like a judgment. Harold rubbed his wrists lightly but said nothing. His composure remained intact, measured, graceful, and painfully calm. "Justice Benton," Chief Evans began carefully, "I cannot express how sorry we are for this unforgivable error." He raised an eyebrow. "Unforgivable, yet somehow repeated generation after generation, Chief." His voice was calm, but every word hit like a gavel. Evans took a slow breath. "You're right. There's no excuse. Those responsible will be disciplined immediately." Harold looked up at her, his eyes steady. "Discipline teaches procedure. Reflection teaches understanding. What your officers need is the latter." The chief swallowed hard. "Sir, I assure you," but before she could continue, the precinct phones started ringing non-stop. The story had leaked. A reporter at the courthouse had recorded the entire incident. Within minutes, video footage of two young white officers handcuffing an elderly black man in a suit was circulating online, with captions like "Elderly man arrested for standing still." By the time the chief walked out of the room, the world had already learned his name. Justice Harold Benton was trending across every social platform. Comments flooded in, "They cuffed the Chief Justice." Unreal. Imagine being that blind to your own bias. This man sentenced criminals, not was one. At noon, TV vans lined the street outside the precinct. Reporters swarmed for statements, flashing cameras and microphones in every direction. Chief Evans stood at the podium, her face tense. "This department sincerely apologizes to Justice Harold Benton and his family," she said, her voice firm but weary. "This incident does not reflect the values of our police force." But the crowd wasn't buying it. Questions flew from all sides. Is it true the officers assumed he was a vagrant because of his race? Will there be any accountability? Did anyone even try to confirm his identity before arresting him? Evans avoided specifics, but her eyes betrayed the truth. She knew exactly what had happened. Meanwhile, Harold sat quietly at home, a cup of tea in his hands, watching the chaos unfold on television. His daughter, Leah Benton, a civil rights attorney, stood pacing behind him. "Dad, we should sue them. This isn't just a mistake, it's humiliation." Harold shook his head slowly. "Leah, you cannot legislate respect. You can only inspire it." "But they handcuffed you in public," she snapped. "After everything you've done for this state, everything you built." Harold smiled faintly. "Then perhaps it's time they remember that justice is not a title, it's a test, and they just failed it." That evening, a formal statement from Harold was released. It read, "I hold no personal resentment toward the officers involved, but I do hope this moment sparks reflection, not outrage. Our justice system must not only see with its eyes, but feel with its conscience." The words went viral instantly. In the precinct, Scott stared at the statement on his phone, his face pale. He's not even angry," he murmured. Miller leaned back, guilt twisting in his chest. "That's worse," he whispered. "He's disappointed." Chief Evans watched them both from her office window. "You two better hope you learn from this," she said quietly. Because the world just learned from him. But the story was far from over. The next morning, Harold received a call from the governor himself, and what he proposed would shake the entire state police system to its core. The following morning dawned heavy with tension. The entire state was still buzzing from the viral footage. Every news station replayed the moment the handcuffs clicked around Justice Harold Benton's wrists. Editorials called it a modern lesson in blind authority. Civil rights groups demanded reform, while police unions scrambled to contain the damage. But inside Harold Benton's home, a modest colonial house tucked away behind oak trees, the mood was strangely serene. He sat by the window, reading the morning paper as sunlight filtered through lace curtains. His daughter, Leah, stood nearby, phone in hand, frowning at yet another reporter's voicemail. "Dad, the media won't stop calling," she said. "They want interviews, statements. Some are even asking if you'll lead a protest." Harold folded his paper carefully. I've led courts, not protests. But maybe it's time I step outside the courtroom again. Before Leah could ask what he meant, the phone on the counter rang, an unknown number. Harold answered calmly. "Justice Benton," came a warm but firm voice. "This is Governor Claiborne. I trust I'm not disturbing you?" Harold smiled faintly. "Only if you've come to arrest me again, Governor." The governor chuckled, though the tension behind his laugh was obvious. "I wish this call were under better circumstances, sir. The whole state's in an uproar. I'd like to meet with you privately this afternoon. There's something I want to propose." When Harold arrived at the state capitol later that day, cameras lined the marble steps, flashing relentlessly. He ignored them, his gait steady, cane tapping rhythmically as he entered the governor's office. Governor Claiborne rose to greet him, extending his hand. "Justice Benton, I owe you an apology, personally and publicly." Harold shook it gently. "Governor, apologies are like verdicts. Their strength depends on what follows." Claiborne nodded solemnly. "Exactly why I called you here. The public's angry, rightfully so, but anger fades and systems stay broken. I want to change that. I'm forming a statewide police ethics commission, an independent body to oversee conduct, training, and accountability." Harold's brows lifted slightly. "Ambitious. And who do you plan to chair this commission?" The governor smiled faintly. "You—" Harold studied him quietly. The room seemed to still around them. "You realize what you're asking, Governor. Reform isn't just policy, it's confrontation. The system resists self-reflection." Claiborne nodded. "That's why it needs someone it respects. And, quite frankly, someone it fears disappointing." For a long moment, Harold said nothing. He turned toward the window, watching the Capitol lawn below where protesters held signs that read, "Justice for justice," and "Dignity has no age." Finally, he spoke. "I'll do it. But on one condition. Anything. I want those 2 young officers on my first review panel, not as defendants, but as students." The governor blinked. "You want them to work with you?" Harold nodded. "Punishment without education is vengeance. I prefer redemption." That evening, a press conference was called. Cameras crowded into the room as Governor Claiborne took the stage beside Harold Benton. "Today," Claiborne announced, "we acknowledge not only a mistake, but a moment of reckoning. Justice Harold Benton has graciously agreed to lead the State Commission on Ethical Policing. This commission will not exist to shame, but to shape, to ensure that what happened on those courthouse steps never happens again." Reporters exploded with questions. "Justice Benton, why agree to work with the same system that humiliated you?" Harold stepped to the microphone. "Because systems only change when those within them learn to see. I was handcuffed not by hatred, but by blindness. I intend to teach sight." Applause broke out, not from everyone, but enough to shift the air. For the first time in days, hope felt possible. Meanwhile, at the precinct, Scott and Miller watched the live broadcast in stunned silence. Scott muttered, "He's not done with us, is he?" Miller shook his head. "No, and I think that's a good thing." 2 days later, the young officers were summoned to a small state facility, an old courthouse now repurposed for police ethics training. When they entered, they found Harold waiting, standing before a chalkboard that read, "Perception versus Reality." He smiled faintly. "Gentlemen," he said, "today we begin your retrial, not in court, but in conscience." The words hung in the air, heavy yet full of promise. And as Scott and Miller sat down, uncertain and uneasy, they had no idea that this encounter would not only reshape their careers, it would change the meaning of justice for an entire generation. The old courthouse smelled faintly of polished oak and history. Sunlight filtered through tall, arched windows, landing across the faces of 20 officers seated in the training room. At the front stood Harold Benton, 80 years old, immaculate in his grey suit, with eyes that had seen the evolution of justice and the scars it left behind. Beside him stood a single blackboard. On it, written in neat white chalk, were the words, "When law forgets humanity, it ceases to be justice." He turned slowly to the group, his cane resting lightly against the table. "I was a judge for 40 years, he began, his voice calm but powerful. "In that time, I sentenced men who broke the law, and I forgave men who broke because of the law. There's a difference." Every officer listened in silence. Among them sat officers Scott and Miller, the 2 who had cuffed him just a week ago. Their faces were pale, their posture tense, their eyes fixed on the floor. "Before we begin," Harold continued, "I'd like you to watch something." He nodded toward a projector. The lights dimmed. On the screen appeared the viral video, those infamous 2 minutes showing Scott and Miller arresting him. The moment played without commentary, without sound, just the image of a frail old man being handcuffed for standing still. When it ended, Harold didn't speak. He simply looked around the room. "What did you see?" he asked. A few murmured responses came. One officer said softly, "A mistake." "Wrong," Harold replied. "You saw the symptom. The mistake wasn't in the handcuffs, it was in the assumption that led to them." He walked slowly towards Scott and Miller. "Gentlemen, tell me, what made me suspicious that day?" Miller swallowed hard. "Sir, we thought you were loitering. You were standing alone looking at the courthouse. And that," Harold said gently, "was enough." Scott's voice cracked. "No, sir, we should have asked more. We should have listened." Harold nodded. "The law gives you power, but power blinds when guided by fear. I've seen fear dressed as protocol more times than I can count. But fear is not procedure. It's prejudice in uniform." He turned to the rest of the class. "You are the face of justice before any judge, jury, or court. Every word you say, every glance, every gesture tells the public what the law feels like. You can't just enforce it. You must embody it." A young Latina officer raised her hand. "Sir, how do we fix something that's built into the system?" Harold smiled faintly. "You start by admitting it's there. The law can't confess, but people can." He then motioned toward the screen again. A new image appeared. One of him decades ago, wearing his judicial robe, shaking hands with then-Governor Ellis after being sworn in as the first black Chief Justice in Georgia's history. "When I sat on that bench," he said, "many didn't see me as a judge. They saw a black man in a robe. I didn't change their vision overnight. I changed their understanding, case by case, verdict by verdict. You will do the same, call by call, encounter by encounter." Scott raised his hand timidly. "Sir, I'm sorry, truly. I wasn't raised to see color, but I see now that not seeing it doesn't make it disappear." Harold nodded slowly. "Acknowledgement is the first act of courage, Officer Scott. The second is change." He turned back to the board and underlined the word humanity. "The day you arrested me, I wasn't angry, I was heartbroken, because I realized how far we've come and how far we still have to go." The room was silent again. Some officers shifted uncomfortably, others fought back emotion. Then Harold smiled, softly, warmly. "But today, I'm not here as your victim. I'm here as your teacher. And I believe in you, every one of you." By the time the session ended, the atmosphere had changed. Scott and Miller approached Harold quietly. "Sir," Miller said, voice trembling, "if there's any way we can make this right—" "You just did," Harold interrupted kindly, "by showing up." The next day, news broke that the Ethics Commission had begun statewide reform, requiring empathy-based training for every officer, using Harold Benton's session as the model. Weeks later, as Harold stood again before the courthouse, this time surrounded by applause, the new plaque was unveiled. It read, "In honor of Justice Harold Benton, who reminded us that true justice begins not in the courtroom, but in the heart." As cameras flashed and the crowd cheered, Harold turned and saw Scott and Miller standing at the edge of the crowd, heads bowed in quiet respect. He raised his cane in greeting, a silent gesture of forgiveness and hope. Leah, standing beside him, whispered, "You did it, Dad. You turned humiliation into history." Harold smiled, eyes glistening. "No, my dear, we turned pain into purpose." And with that, the man once handcuffed for standing still walked forward, standing taller than ever before, a living symbol of what justice should truly mean.